All right, welcome to this new episode of Data in the Hallway. My name is Ray Paik at PingCAP, joined by my colleague Daniel, who's joining us from Paraguay this week. And happy to welcome Matt Germonprez, who I've known for a long time. We started working on chaos. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a bit. I don't know, maybe it's like 2016 or 2017. We've known each other for a while, and
It's
I
been a
appreciate
while.
you. Yeah,
Agreed.
yeah. So appreciate you joining. Let's just start off. Matt, just introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, where you're located, and then we'll get things started.
Yeah, sure. So I kind of have two roles. One, I'm kind of by day a professor in the College of Information Science and Technology at the University of Nebraska-Omaha. Teach classes, do research, help help around the university. And then also I'm one of the co-founders of the Chaos Project, and I was a prior board member or director of the board of the Chaos Project, and I'm currently a board member of the Chaos Project. So I've been around that project since the start.
Cool, cool. Welcome, and good to see you joining us from sunny
Oh yeah,
Nebraska.
I'm in Omaha,
Yeah,
Nebraska. I guess you
cool.
could have figured that out from the
Yeah,
university that I'm
yeah,
at. But
yeah. I know. Like large swath of the U.S. this week, the weather's been kind of horrendous. A lot of places have had
it is
weather challenges,
not
but
affecting
yeah,
us today, but it has in the
cool.
past. Yep.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, obviously the top topic today is about metrics in open source communities. I mean, this is something, I've been involved in community management since like 2014. And even back then, especially for a large open source project, there was an interest in terms of how do we measure like who's contributing and who's involved in projects in various different ways. And what was surprising, I mean, from like the open source project or commercial perspective, that wasn't that surprising. But when I first met you and other folks from academia, Matt, I was really surprised that there was this large, like a huge interest amongst academics as well, in not just in terms of metrics, but open source.
Mhm.
I wanted to sort of ask you about, when this interest in academia got started, and what were some of the like the reasons and rationale for why people got involved and started doing research.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, so
Yeah.
actually I had just done a fairly extensive literature review for a paper. I'm
Mhm.
not going to give you the whole lit
Right.
review of the paper, but I think in academe, a lot of the interest started in the 90s, kind of back in the day when open source was this like kind of egalitarian roots, like collaborative space. Like, how can this even be a thing? How can we even work
Mhm.
together? To produce software. I think there was a lot of interest in from academics back in those times because it was kind of moving out of, just the one corporate or one organizational setting doing doing software development, and open source kind of challenged that. In the early 2000s was really, I think, when people started to get interested in the corporate side of open source. So some folks, Joe Feller and Brian Fitzgerald, really kind of helped lead some of our interest in that area. And I would say that kind of coincided with a lot of the corporate interest in open source, kind of the late 90s, early 2000s. So academe was not too far behind on that one. It's evolved over the years from there. You probably know things like crowdsourcing, right? So it has kind
Mhm.
of, like, sometimes academics would kind of mix and match open source with crowdsourcing, and I think that became kind of entangled for a while, not in a great way, because they
Mhm.
are, from my perspective, pretty distinctly different. And I think at this point it's now separated again, and we can continue to ask questions around, say, organizational engagement or foundation engagement or corporate engagement in open source, and how that kind of affects the trajectory of open source projects, and to which health is an important component of this. I'd say a lot of the research does focus on trace data metrics around health,
Mhm.
so things you can get from like the GitHub API, or things you can get from an MSR database. And so I think there's a big attraction towards doing kind of big data analytics on some of that trace data around health. So
right,
that's kind of where research is at the moment.
right. Cool. No, I mean, appreciate the background. I mean, you kind of mentioned that things got like a tangle for a while, but
Mhm.
I actually thought that was interesting because I mean, I had a good fortune of coming to visit you for like, I think you had a 2 day
Yeah.
workshop a while ago. And there were like me and one other person that was sort of representing open source community, but there are people from Wikimedia Foundation,
Yep.
like citizen science. So, um, I didn't like immediately see that for a while, but I saw sort of like a common theme. I mean, these people are doing for for the most part, like just contributing in their own time. Like they're not getting compensated necessarily, but I thought that ethos was common across like
It
different
certainly.
areas, like citizen science and open source. So I thought that was interesting. But I guess I also see your point about if it they're not exactly the same thing. So uh, yeah, I remember those discussion. I actually enjoyed that workshop.
I'm glad.
So like yeah, I think that was like 2018. Don't ask me why, how I remember the year, but uh, so yeah, so I mean, tell us about your research areas. I mean, personally, like
Sure.
over the past, 5, 6 years, like which aspects of open collaboration, open source, like what were you did you focus on? So,
Yeah, sure. So I will say, kind of as a researcher from my own perspective,
mm,
one of the many reasons I'm involved in the Chaos Project is I think it's important, at least for myself, to
mm,
be an active member in open source projects, to be able
mm,
to speak to them directly.
all right.
So I think that being close and being proximate. So, for example, say working with SPDX, which was a community I worked with prior to Chaos, or working with Busology, or working now in the Chaos Project, or working with other organizations that are in open source is really important for me because, like Ray, I think when you and I met, you were at GitLab at the time, and like there's just so much knowledge that you have that helps me understand open source, and I think it's really important for me to stay grounded with the folks that are doing open source on the day to day. So that's just kind of my own personal philosophy. Um, so from there, one of the things that I'm trying to do from my research is to have an impact in the world, whether that's helping organizations think about open source or helping foundations think about open source, and also publish academic research. So I do try to balance both of these things to have a real applied impact and to also have a more of an academic impact. Sometimes those two things are a little bit different. It's a little bit hard to keep them separate or keep them together. It's a little bit hard to do both of them, but I really do kind of focus on that. So that's, the Chaos Project is, I think, from an external perspective, largely focused on the applied side of things. So when you look at metrics or metrics models or the software that we're developing, that's really about helping organizations engage in this space. But at the same time, we do academic papers in this area. So one academic paper, for example, that we had just recently concluded, or at least under review, was taking a look at something we call social comparison. And so the premise is if you're an organization and you are using open source community health metrics just by yourself, but you have no context for how you're doing against other organizations, it can be challenging sometimes. So kind of like a human health metaphor, if your heartbeat, is 65 beats per minute, and you have no baseline against anybody else, like it's hard to know, like, am I doing a good job? Is that a bad job? Should I try to lower that? Should I try to raise that? So social comparison is a paper that we were just looking at and trying to understand how organizations look around themselves to, kind of contextualize the metrics that they might care about. So not just the metrics themselves, but how they are doing in relation to other people. So that was a more recent paper that I was working on.
Cool, cool. Yeah, that's that's interesting. I mean, it's amazing how big of a, I mean, cottage industry may not be a right term. I mean, I don't want to sound disrespectful. Like even to this day, like you see new metrics community or new metrics tools like popping up, and
Mhm.
even like internally, I mean, Daniel, you know more about this than I do. I think I just shared the link with you, Matt, a couple of weeks ago. Like
Yeah.
we have our own project called OSS Insight, and
Mhm.
I wanted to sort of get the origin story, and talked to our CEO a couple of days ago, like, why were you interested in this? And it was, the combination of a lot of things. I mean, he sort of wanted to look into uh, an application that could demonstrate some of the capabilities of our own product. But it's just personal interest. Him and like two of our other co-founders, they're open source people at heart, and just like a personal interest, like in GitHub, using AI, can we easily do comparisons of like the two different like the projects, for example? I think um, if people are considering adopting a tool or even joining a project, I mean that's sort of like, how does this sort of compare with this other project in the data analytics industry that I'm
Yep.
familiar with? So I think it gives them a good um, I mean, it's not going to give you a whole picture, but yeah, I mean, in terms of like contribution or review health, et cetera, like whatever you're interested in, I think that's why there's still a proliferation of all these tools. Um,
Agreed. Agreed.
yeah.
And I don't think there's any tool that will like
Mm.
perfectly describe a community for you,
Right.
like
Right.
health perspective. But
Right.
as you say, Ray, like it can help provide insight. In the Chaos Project, we often just say trying to move off zero. So lots of
Mm.
times you have just no insight on a project at
Right.
all, like nothing.
Right.
You got nothing. So I think through metrics and through software, through tooling, or through programs that can't necessarily deploy, say, trace data metrics, you can start kind of moving off zero and improving
Mm.
your understanding of the communities that you care about for whatever reason.
Right. Right. Cool.
Yeah,
Yeah. Go ahead.
yeah. So I think many years ago there was the whole issue with OpenSSL,
Mhm.
which was just like this one open source project, wasn't doing well, wasn't a lot of contribution from outside, but like everyone depended on it, and they just didn't have any funding. And
Mm.
I think now with all the tools and metrics, it's easier to see like what dependencies a project might have, how those like important dependencies are doing, and also for those dependencies to demonstrate like why they need funding and how they're doing and how they're improving. So if they get funds, they need to demonstrate how they're improving. So I think that's a really big, good demonstration of how this is important for everyone.
I I 100% agree with that, and I think that raises a really good point of like there's health of say a particular project, so like just one project, but then there's also the health of an ecosystem, which is this dependency chain of projects. And if there's failure, like let's say my project is doing fine healthy wise, but in the ecosystem there's a problem, as you mentioned with OpenSSL, or I think, remember when there was well, anyway, with OpenSSL. Um, and when that, when we have problems like that, there are all these then abnormal stabilizing mechanisms that have to occur inside of an ecosystem to address that breakdown. And so gaining insight into that ecosystem is something that I think in the Chaos Project we're doing. We're starting to kind of move that way, not just project by project, but also kind of collections of projects. And I 100% agree with the importance of that.
Yeah. I think like it, especially in the early days of my community management, I think a lot of focus, me personally, was on like who's contributing, which organizations are. But health is much more beyond that. Like, I mean, like, both you, Daniel, and Matt, you're saying like things like dependencies and looking at things like, bus factors, right? I mean, those all contribute to you, how stable or how healthy the project is. So
Mhm.
yeah, I mean there are lots of different areas to look at for sure. Uh, so I guess like a last question on academic research or work that's going on in academia. What's sort of like I mean, I don't want to focus too much on like what's trendy and what's hot, but looking ahead, like next few years, like what kind of new research or work do you foresee happening
So
in open source or metrics in
yeah, I
general?
think one of the areas that we're kind of looking at from an academic perspective is the cultural differences around open source and how people kind of like say from an open source 101 or a hello world open source, how new individuals would engage with open source, and what are the cultural barriers or cultural differences that may support that or kind of impede that. I think that's a big question, for a lot of people in open source, and continuing to think about engaging folks from a global perspective is a really, I think, interesting area, and something that can, again, kind of the things I said earlier, have a real positive impact in trying to support open source as a whole, as this giant collective, but then also answering kind of questions around what are some of those cultural differences that we see with respect to this kind of this uniform thing that we often think of as open source.
Right. Cool. All right. So, yeah, we've obviously talked a lot about chaos, and for people that are watching us on YouTube or watching the podcast on YouTube, I'll add links to the Chaos Project and at OSS Insight. I think those are two like projects we talked about. Yeah. So, tell us a little bit about chaos, how it started. I mean, what it stands for. I mean, people not have necessarily a positive connotation with the word chaos, but yeah, tell us a little bit about chaos and how things got started.
Sure. So so I'd been doing kind of corporate research or corporate engagement with open source research prior to the Chaos Project. So I had just a big interest in kind of that dynamic and how for-profit corporations were kind of changing the trajectory of open source. And it's not the entirety of open source, but in that particular piece of the pie. So I had a chance to talk with some folks at GitHub about kind of how we would understand organizational engagement with open source, and that kind of led to some early funding from the Sloan Foundation to kind of investigate this a little bit more and how we might understand how corporations or how organizations more broadly think about open source, and what are the characteristics for engagement. So through that funding, we just kind of continued to do our investigation around corporate engagement, and it was actually at a Linux Foundation, I don't know what it was called then, Collab Summit or Leadership Summit or Member Summit. I don't remember what it was at the time.
Right.
And we did a birds of a feather session. So we just kind of put it out there if any organization had an interest in the health of the projects that they rely on, or the health of the projects that they have open sourced themselves that they're looking to support. We probably had about 50 or 60 people show up at the birds of a feather session. So clearly there was a lot of interest in this particular topic. So I had a chance to talk with some folks at the Linux Foundation just about the success of that birds of a feather session. And right around that time too, I think Bitergia, who is an organization that's involved in the Chaos Project, was looking to open source Grimoire Lab, which is the software tool that's now part of the Chaos Project. So I think kind of open sourcing that tool at the time, open sourcing Grimoire Lab at the time, and then just this general interest around health was kind of brought together to create the Chaos Project, which is a Linux Foundation project, which stands for Community Health Analytics for Open Source Software. So it actually works.
Yeah, no, it's
the letters work.
It's got a cool and memorable acronym. So
yeah, it's actually, I think it's, believe it or not, served us quite well in the open source community. So and so from there, it was just about kind of specifying how we would work, working with the Linux Foundation. It is interesting to think that I want to say we were the 59th project at the Linux Foundation, 59, and I think they're well over 800 at this point. Right. So it seems like forever ago. A lot has changed. So anyway, that's kind of the origins of the Chaos Project and how we started. And a lot has changed since we have begun as well.
No, I mean the growth has been phenomenal. I was at a conference somewhere, and the person was talking about like uh, important like open source projects, and one of them, that logo that he had on the slide was actually Chaos.
Right
And
on.
yeah, I didn't even know they were like, they were using Chaos at the company. And yeah, I mean the awareness and the knowledge of the project, with very little marketing budget, that I mean almost no marketing budget, that project has, it's been pretty phenomenal. It's grown pretty organically. um, so, I mean, you mentioned like Grimoire Lab, and obviously, like researchers from like you and like University of Missouri, for
Yep.
example. Like, who else is involved in the project? Like, who else are contributing in terms of like companies or organizations or people that,
Yeah.
uh, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, so as I mentioned, we are a Linux Foundation project. So I'd like to say,
Mm.
thanks to the LF, because they do a lot of support through events, through legal consult, just all variety of things. So that's been just a great thing. Other organizations, so there are a number of funding organizations that have an interest in this as well. So as I had mentioned, the Sloan Foundation has continued to fund the Chaos project really since inception. We just received a new grant, honestly, just in April of this year for $1.6 million that enables us to continue to support our community manager, Elizabeth Barron.
Mm.
And we're going to be hiring a new director of data science, because one of the things that we want to do is, with our metrics and the data that we have, we've been kind of agnostic on what might be a good trend or what might be a bad trend. We kind of say, like, whatever, age of an issue is a metric, and you as an organization might want to look at it, but we don't say really anything beyond that. And we want to start moving into a world where we can say this is why you might want to look at it, because it can have impacts, cascading impacts downstream if you don't address it. And we really need a director of data science to help us do that. The Ford Foundation has also been a funder of the Chaos Project, particularly around how we think around our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and how we help organizations and projects best center DEI. And then we've also been funded by Mozilla in the past, and we've worked with organizations like Red Hat as well in the past. So in terms of companies that have been involved, it's a wide variety of organizations. So we are actually working with the TiDB group right now. And so the TiDB group is a group of really generally corporate oriented open source program offices that have representatives from kind of, the who's who of technology companies. And so we have a metrics group within the TiDB group, taking a look at what are the metrics that might be valuable to tell stories of value for the organization, or what are the metrics that people use. So we work a lot with those organizations. We also have university OSPOs, open source program offices, are starting to become a thing. So we're working with a number of universities as they think about the professors or the academics at universities developing software themselves and trying to create open source products out of that. So how do you think about, say, tech transfer as an example? So, without like just kind of naming companies or naming universities, we have these kind of different context areas where we are working with different organizations to help answer really open source community health related questions that are specific, say, to corporate open source program offices or university open source program offices. We have another group that's helping in the scientific software community. So things like Pandas and NumPy, these large open source communities. I'm helping them answer questions. And there's probably going to be some overlap between those, the questions that they want to understand, but there's also probably some specificity in terms of health related questions that a corporation may ask versus health related questions that a university might ask.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's great to see like all those foundations, and I mean, outside of LF, like other like open source projects like Mozilla that's been a big supporter of this. I mean, I think that's definitely helps with not just funding, but awareness and people contributing. And yeah, it's been really cool to see the project sort of evolve. I mean, on a sort of like I guess a related question. I mean, the project's been around, I mean, well over 5 years now. Like, what are you most proud of from the project?
Yeah, so I thought about this question. Like, there are
Yeah,
many things, and I'll pick
yeah,
one.
yeah.
So we talked a lot about health metrics that may be obtainable, say, through trace data, through like GitHub, the GitHub API. And those can be, questions around, say, pull requests, or questions around issues, or questions around discussions, whatever those particular metrics might be. In the CHAOSS project, we also have a working group focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And a lot of those metrics are certainly less attainable through trace data. And so a lot of those metrics requires a different style of investigation. So they may be around codes of conduct, they may be around family friendliness at an event, they may be around demographics within your community. So trace data won't always tell you these kinds of things. And so in an effort to one of the things we do in the CHAOSS project is we try to ensure that the metrics that we develop are applicable in practice. So for example, like a lot of the metrics that we have developed around issues would be implementable through a tool like Insights. You know what I mean? Like it's possible to take a look at those and deploy them. But a lot of the DEI metrics are not that way. So we've had to develop programs that help bring those metrics into practice and put them in front of people where people can really think and reflect on those metrics. So we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion event badging program, and we've badged over 100 open source events. And really what it is an open and transparent review process where we ask people, event organizers, to comment on how they're attending to things like family friendliness, how they're attending to things like project or event accessibility, how they're attending to things like code of conducts at the event. And we have reviewers in the CHAOSS project kind of take a look at what has been said in the application and whether or not that is true, and if it's published, published for all conference attendees. And so we've had a lot of success with our DEI event badging program. And I will say that as of yesterday, GitHub just announced we're working with a project called All In, which is going to do All In CHAOSS DEI project badging. So we're actually doing some work in that regard as well, which is quite different than event badging, just because projects and events they're so vastly different from one another and how we think about DEI within them. So really, I think one of the things that I'd like to just highlight is our efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and not only developing metrics, but really helping ensure that those metrics have an impact in the world.
Right. I mean, obviously it's not like you said, like how many people or who contributed to, which repo. That's, traceable, it's easily quantifiable, but the EEI is not on that spectrum. So,
correct.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's another reason why, because, association with a lot of these different events, that probably help with the visibility of the project. Yeah, it's been really cool to see. Daniel, were you about to like I've been kind of dominating the questioning. Not sure if you want to chime in here or not, but.
Well, it's really good to see all the different kinds of metrics, not just like the very basic trace-based ones, but also the other ones. But about the trace-based metrics, I think it's quite easy to game metrics because that's been done with ticketing systems, etc. Is there any way, you see, how people should be protecting against that, or is it possible to detect these kind of issues?
It's a super good question, and I don't have a super good answer for you. So yes, I agree that many of these metrics can be gamed. So as an example, say a metric around contributions as tied to work performance. You know what I mean? So if I have an employee working in an open source community and contributions are one of the metrics that I would use as the company to kind of evaluate my employees, that is quite easily gameable, right? Or lowering a response to an issue is also quite easily gameable. I can lower that response time in just a couple minutes. I really like the suggestion of how, so to your question, no, we don't have an answer for that at the moment. A lot of the times what we just say is, this is something to be aware of, and this can happen. But I'd like to think through your comment about how we might be able to detect that gaming. I don't know. That's an interesting thought. Like how we could detect, say, 2 standard deviation moves within a short period of time by one individual. You know what I mean? So we can look at a long-term moving average, and if over the course of a week we see a giant spike or a giant decline in something, it's probably not going to tell you that it's being gamed, but it will at least tell you that it's something you might want to look at as potential for an area of gaming, would be my thoughts, at least here. Something to think about more. It's a great question.
Yeah, sounds like a good solution.
Yeah. I mean, that would be hard to sort of, how would you like, implementation would be pretty difficult, I would think. Like, I guess you're trying to flag like unusual, like, I mean, I don't know if unusual is the right word, like unusual activity by certain individuals, right? But yeah, no, that's a really good question, Daniel. I mean, maybe we should bring this up to one of the working groups at Chaos Project and talk about this, but that's a possibility. Cool. Matt, were you about to say something? Like I may have cut you off, but
No, I think
yeah.
Daniel was about to say something.
All right. Sorry, Daniel. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I think there are just like so many different ways of like gaming a system. So detecting might also need like a few different ways to detect different ways of gaming the system. But yeah, would be interesting to have insight in that.
You know, it would be something to think about, I think, as we move into the data science. You know, as I mentioned, as we're hiring a director of data science, I think this could be something that would be within an area to investigate. Because this is, again, you're through gaming, you're ascribing a bit of value judgment against the metrics and the move of the metric, which is okay. It's just something we haven't done so far in the Chaos Project, and gaming seems to have a, like, it's a negative implication. Like it's not something that you want to see, would be my my first reaction towards it.
Right.
But how do we effectively see that? I think that's a great question, and something I think that we could think about from a data science perspective. So thank you for that.
Cool. All right. Yeah, I just sort of close the conversation on chaos, and I may have mentioned this to you too, Matt. I think chaos served as a sort of a like a model for a lot of efforts that are happening, including OSS Insight, because when this was given to one of our R&D teams from the CEO to develop open source dashboard, like, I mean, a couple of projects that I think our team, this is before my time, they looked at was StepStat at CNCF, and the other was Chaos. So, I mean, whether, you know, how much of that was sort of, you know, how much of which components were sort of replicated in OSS Insight, like, I'm not sure, but it at least serves as a good reference point. I think that's one of the reasons why you started the Chaos Project anyways, to keep people a starting point for a tool. And then I think you also mentioned there's another community in China that developed their own sort of almost like a mini like LF project structure to create an open source metrics, right? And
OSS
yeah,
Compass. Yep.
yeah. And then when I went to the website, they specifically mentioned like Chaos as sort of the one of the inspirations for their project.
Yeah, so we have worked with them quite a bit
Yeah.
with respect to deploying the chaos metrics as well as the metrics models.
Right. Cool. Awesome. Yeah, thanks for a trip down the memory lane for me. I'm sure other people have found it interesting too. So, yeah, and just to close, I mean, Daniel, did you have anything else before I jump to the last question, or?
No, just go ahead.
Yeah. All right, cool. So this is sort of the trivia question I asked all the guests so far, because we've had guests from Mumbai, like Sacramento, etc., and you're coming to us from Omaha, Nebraska. Tell us something about Omaha that people may not know about. I think, like, especially people in the U.S. may have certain stereotypes about Omaha and or Nebraska in general. But tell us about Omaha that you like or proud of. It could be
Well,
anything.
yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe I can give you maybe a kind of a global one and then a short US one.
Yeah.
For those of you that don't know, Warren Buffett is from Omaha and he lives here in Omaha, and he just actually doesn't live too many blocks away from me. He still lives in his house that he bought in the 50s and lived there ever since. So he's as a local here in the city. So and then from a more US perspective, you may not know, but from a presidential election perspective, the state of Nebraska splits our votes. So we're only one of two states that does this.
All
So
right.
basically the city of Omaha kind of votes for the president by themselves to some degree. So there's one electoral vote that essentially comes from the Omaha metropolitan area for
Right.
president. So it's not the entire state. So
Right.
there is just kind of it's split. Us and Maine are the only two states that
Right.
have split electoral. Every other state, the entirety of electoral votes go to whoever
The
wins
winner.
plurality
Right.
of that state. And Nebraska
Right.
is not that way.
Right. If I remember correctly, it's like 1 out of 4. Like I think Nebraska has 4 electoral votes
We
and
have we
Omaha
have
has
five. So
oh
two,
5. Okay.
yep. So
Okay.
two come from a plurality. However, the
Uh,
state votes collectively,
right.
two go to there. And then there's
Right.
3 districts in the state, and each district is given one electoral vote. And
Right.
Omaha is essentially a big enough metropolitan area that we get one electoral vote. And we are quite different from the rest of the state often.
Yeah. Cool. Nice reminder as we're gearing up for, I guess, 2024 election next year. But
Yep.
yeah, thanks for the poli-sci 101
There you
overview
go.
to
Yep.
finish off our podcast. So appreciate your time, Matt. I'm sure I'll be talking to you again in one of the chaos calls very soon. And Daniel, thanks for joining us from Paraguay. It looks lovely. Hope you enjoy the rest of your stay down there. Yeah, and for people that are listening, thanks for listening. We'll be coming up. Actually, one of the future episodes will dedicate entirely to OSS Insight, like the genesis of OSS Insight and a little bit more architectural details of how the solution was built. So do tune in for that as well. All right. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Daniel. See
Thanks,
you folks
everybody.
soon.